I don't think there's ever been a moment of greater uncertainty in the relationship between the United States and Russia than the one we are now going through. And that means that we are forced, as Americans, to look for new guidelines in our approach to our relations with that country.
In February 1946, the deputy head of the American embassy in Moscow took it upon himself to explain the perplexing behavior of the Soviet government. The topic, he cabled his superiors, involves questions so intricate, so delicate, so strange to our form of thought that he could not be brief. His missive exceeded 5,000 words. In Washington, the long telegram was a sensation. As the U.S. and the Soviet Union were transitioning from wartime allies to arch enemies, it offered an intermediate approach between appeasement and confrontation. And although its author became the architect of American Cold War strategy, he remained an outsider who for half a century was one of the most outspoken critics of his country's foreign policy. Next on a special episode of Great Decisions, Father of Containment, the George Kennan story.
Great Decisions is produced by the Foreign Policy Association in association with Thomson Reuters. Funding for Great Decisions is provided by PricewaterhouseCoopers LLP and the Nelson B. Delavan Foundation.
When 21-year-old George Kennan entered the Foreign Service in 1925, he could not help but feel out of place in a stodgy bureaucracy dominated by America's elite families.
In my first words, to the effect that I was born in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, my voice broke into falsetto on the second syllable of Wisconsin and set the board roaring with laughter.
But the Foreign Service was about to undergo a transformation.
When he went into the Foreign Service, the State Department, they decided for the first time to develop area specialists. And he was given a choice. He could have taken Chinese or Japanese or Arabic or Russian, and he picked Russian.
From his teachers at Berlin's Oriental Institute, Kennan learned a formal type of Russian.
We started speaking, and suddenly his Russian sounded like it came out of the old Russian novels. Like I was reading War and Peace, and the way he used words, and the words he used, that I knew those words, but we never used them in the Soviet Union.
Kennan's first exposure to Russian culture began a love affair that was to last throughout his life. Even decades later, he was liable to become emotional when he encountered anything that reminded him of the Russia he loved.
Seeing the cherry orchard stirred all the rusty, untuned strings of the past and of my own youth. Riga, and the Russian landscape, and the staggering, unexpected familiarity and convincingness of the Chekhovian world. It stirred up, in other words, my Russian self.
Although Kennan admired Russian culture, he was horrified by the Soviet political system. From diplomatic posts in Riga and Moscow, he watched with alarm as Joseph Stalin's brutal purges claimed the lives of millions of Soviet citizens.
My father, Chip Boland, was a Foreign Service officer, a very close friend and colleague of George Kennan's, and he was at the show trial of Nikolai Bukharin. The diplomatic corps was invited to come see these show trials, which were quite spectacular. It wasn't a pleasant spectacle, but it was part of their job.
My father lived there in 1937. He was well aware of the purges, and he was horrified by it, and he felt that we didn't have a very clear understanding of what the Soviet Union was.
Having witnessed up close the worst abuses of the Soviet regime, Kennan was determined to tell the truth about what he had seen, even at a moment when Stalin was a vital ally.
He wasn't a warm man in the sense you didn't hug George Kennan, but you were instantly struck by the depth of his thinking. He gave you a full picture. It was impressive, and he was not shy. He spoke truth as he saw it, to power as he recognized it.
In February 1946, inside the code room of the American Embassy in Moscow, 22-year-old Martha Halloran was preparing for a date.
I happened to have a heavy date because there was a big dance at one of the other embassies, and we wanted to start out early. And he comes in about 7 o'clock. And my encounter with history involved trying to talk him out of sending it. But as he said, he insisted at that time that they had asked for that, he was going to give it to them.
Kennan later acknowledged that his 5,500-word manifesto, which took Halloran a full 2 hours to send by cipher, was an outrageous encumberment of the telegraphic process.
He was sick, and my father was very creative when he was sick, and he dictated the whole long telegram. There was limits on how long a telegram could be. Nobody was allowed to send a telegram of 5,000 words. But he felt that his message was so important.
In Washington, Kennan's long telegram found an eager audience. James Forrestal, the Secretary of the Navy, ordered hundreds of copies distributed in his department. A printout reached the desk of Harry Truman. And within days, Soviet spies were passing around the document as well.
If none of my previous literary efforts had seemed to evoke even the faintest tinkle from the bell at which they were aimed, this one, to my astonishment, struck it squarely and sent it vibrating with a resonance that was not to die down for many months. My reputation was made. My voice now carried.
What member of this Security Council is assisting in the Security Council the invaders, the Soviet Union?
Kennan's memorandum came at a moment of increasing anxiety about the deepening Cold War.
From Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, an iron curtain has descended across the continent.
Gone was the happy talk of we can create a UN and all get together and sort the world out. Gone was the happy talk that Churchill, Roosevelt, and Stalin could get together, they could solve problems. We were faced then with the onset of the Cold War. And if anything, I think George Kennan provided an intellectual framework for our side.
People were sort of casting around, trying to figure out what was going on, and he gave them a complete framework in which to understand what was happening and what the Soviet Union represented.
In his analysis, Kennan highlighted Stalin's need to maintain an antagonistic posture toward the West.
At the bottom of the Kremlin's neurotic view of world affairs is the traditional and instinctive Russian sense of insecurity. Russian rulers have invariably sensed that their rule was relatively archaic in form, fragile and artificial in its psychological foundation, and unable to stand comparison or contact with the political systems of Western countries.
I think Kennan was one of the first people who actually put it out for the world that a lot of sources of Soviet conduct come out not out of superiority, but of a great inferiority. And so they need to flex the muscle to show that they are not to be trifled with.
According to Kennan, the only way to counter the Soviet government was to stand up to it directly.
It does not take unnecessary risks. Impervious to the logic of reason, it is highly sensitive to the logic of force. For this reason, it can easily withdraw, and usually does when strong resistance is encountered at any point. Thus, if the adversary has sufficient force and makes clear his readiness to use it, he rarely has to do so.
After returning to Washington, Kennan set about writing a more formal essay to provide the theoretical underpinning of the American Cold War strategy. published in July 1947 in Foreign Affairs magazine, it bore the title, The Sources of Soviet Conduct. In place of Kennan's name, the article was credited to the pseudonym X.
If ideology convinces the rulers of Russia that truth is on their side and that they can therefore afford to wait, we are free to examine objectively the validity of that premise. The Soviet thesis not only implies complete lack of control by the West over its own economic destiny, it likewise assumes Russian unity, discipline, and patience over an infinite period.
Kennan was less worried about the Soviet Union than about the ability of his own country to sustain a consistent defense of the liberal institutions it had helped establish.
The issue of Soviet-American relations is, in essence, a test of the overall worth of the United States as a nation among nations. To avoid destruction, the United States need only measure up to its own best traditions and prove itself worthy of preservation as a great nation.
The measure of America is that it upholds its own principles. It measures itself as a nation by being its best, not being the best, but being its best. And he continued to make this argument for 50 years.
Kennan believed that the most urgent problem facing the U.S. was the need to rebuild Western Europe so that communism would not prove attractive. He found an ally in the Secretary of State, George Marshall, who invited him to help plan the logistics of Europe's recovery.
There's no doubt whatever in my mind that if we decide to do this thing, we can do it successfully. And there's also no doubt in my mind that the whole world hangs in the balance.
Kennan opposed confronting the Soviet Union militarily, instead working to halt Soviet expansion by political means. From his position in the State Department, he began coordinating operations with the nascent CIA.
He joined forces with my father coming out of OSS in deploying clandestine measures, intelligence gathering and special operations, Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty eventually. On the propaganda side, also groups that infiltrated behind the lines of Eastern Europe and inside the erstwhile Soviet Union, starting and providing organizational structure to people who had fled from Eastern Europe to Western Europe. That would have been classic Kennan.
But Kennan soon began to chafe that his opinions seemed to have less impact on American policymakers than he wished.
I felt like a court jester, expected to enliven discussion, privileged to say shocking things, valued as an intellectual gadfly on the hides of lower colleagues, but not to be taken fully seriously.
Within the State Department, what particularly galled Kennan was that his own vision for containing the Soviet Union seemed to carry little weight. When NATO was formed in 1949, Kennan railed against his colleagues who had masterminded its creation.
They all mistake the Soviet threat for a military one and feel that there must be a military response in the form of the NATO alliance. I am not enthusiastic. I feel this will cause us to take our eye off the ball of economic recovery. But I am overruled. Military thinking here and in Europe has taken over from political thinking. People are reverting to 19th century patterns of thought.
Both he and my father were arguing against this total monolithic view of the Soviet Union as a juggernaut bent on dominating the whole world and capturing as much territory as possible. They didn't think that the challenge from the Soviet Union was primarily a military one. They thought it was political.
In 1952, Kennan achieved his highest position in the American government when he became U.S. ambassador to the Soviet Union. But the new tensions of the Cold War afforded him far less freedom to engage with ordinary Russians than he had enjoyed as a young man.
I reside in the solitary splendor of Spaso House. but it is a gilded cage. I, as ambassador, am the Soviet Union's enemy number one. The walls of the embassy compound are floodlit from the outside and patrolled by armed guards, like a prison.
We had filing cabinets with hundreds of 5x7 cards. And he would read the Soviet press and he would track where generals went and he would track who was doing what. The other ambassadors did not speak Russian or read Russian. And so they came around to ask my father his advice. And my father always felt this was one of the reasons that Stalin so disliked him.
He was talking to some reporters and he drew some comparisons between Nazi Germany and Soviet Russia. And for the relatively newly arrived ambassador, that was too much for Stalin. And they announced that Ambassador Kennan would not be allowed back into the Soviet Union. He was a brilliant intellectual and an extraordinary writer. He was a master of the essay form. He was not a very good diplomat.
I just don't think he saw himself as just a diplomat. He saw himself as a scholar. He saw himself as an analyst. He saw himself as a philosopher.
Throughout his career, Kennan retained a strong preference for policy over politics.
He would have rebelled at the thought that somebody said, "But George, you must be an astute politician." His answer would have been, "It is my job to analyze, to assess, and to advise what is the right thing to do in terms of national interest. It's not my job to sell it politically."
I first met Kennan in 1954. Kennan announced that he was going to run for Congress, and this produced hysteric laughter from Atchison and Nitze. "Tell us all about it, George. You in Congress?" "Well," George says, "of course, I won't run if I have any opposition." More hysteria. Instinctively, Atchison and Nitze, like most of the rest of us, would have thought the idea of George Kennan being in the House of Representatives was a funny idea. I mean, he had nothing but contempt for American politicians, so why did he want to join them?
From outside the government, Kennan watched with dismay as the policy of containment, which he had once articulated, expanded to encompass military confrontations he did not support.
We must say in Southeast Asia, as we did in Europe, in the words of the Bible, "Hitherto shalt thou come, but no further."
I can think of nothing we need more at this stage than a readiness to relax. Not to worry so much about these remote countries scattered across the Southern Crescent. To let them go their own way. Not to regard their fate as our exclusive responsibility.
Kennan, over time, recognized that he'd let a polecat run loose in the crowd, and he didn't quite know how to bring it back under control again, and that people weren't listening to him anymore. They'd changed the image, they had the bit in their teeth, and were running with it.
So the later half of his life, he was busy testifying for nuclear disarmament. I once worked for Hubert Humphrey, who had a subcommittee in the Senate, arms control. And Kennan would come down to testify there, and different groups of people would come away from the hearing thinking different things, both of them thinking they agreed with Kennan. And so Kennan had the misfortune, or perhaps the great good fortune, of being appreciated by people misinterpreting what he said.
Kennan lived to see the end of the Cold War and the collapse of the Soviet Union. His patient strategy had paid dividends. Just as he had predicted, Moscow's communist regime had eventually fallen apart from inside.
Containment was successful. It worked to impede and deny Soviet expansionism. It was an important principle and an important policy approach by the United States, and it worked. And of course, Kennan was the author of that beginning way back in 1946.
I did call him when the Soviet Union broke apart, and I said, "My God, you were right." And he was all gloom and doom. Oh, this is too fast, it's happened too fast, and this is going to cause a lot of trouble.
Kennan was increasingly concerned that his country was failing to take advantage of the new opening. He had always disapproved of NATO, an organization he saw as a provocation. Now, with Russia weakened, President Bill Clinton was trying to expand something Kennan viewed as an anachronism.
Today we welcome Hungary, Poland, the Czech Republic, finally erasing the boundary line the Cold War artificially imposed on the continent of Europe.
Expanding NATO would be the most fateful error of American policy in the entire post-Cold War era. Such a decision may be expected to inflame the nationalistic, anti-Western, and militaristic tendencies in Russian opinion, to have an adverse effect on the development of Russian democracy, and to restore the atmosphere of the Cold War to East-West tensions.
I think he was spot on. I think the Russians got a mindset after the expansion, and they said, hey, you know, these guys are going to come right up to our border, and this is an existential threat to Russia.
Knowing the Russians, knowing the Soviets, he knew that that's how they're going to take it. They're going to take it personally.
When President George W. Bush nominated Colin Powell to serve as Secretary of State in 2001, Kennan sensed an opportunity. He hoped Powell could restore the legacy of a fellow general-turned-secretary, his patron, George Marshall. So Kennan, now 96 years old, wrote to Powell with a warning.
This office has, in recent decades, in my view, been seriously misused and distorted. The absence of the Secretary of State for prolonged periods deprives the President of what should have been the latter's wisest, most qualified, and most responsible source of advice on foreign policy problems.
Powell heeded Kennan's advice, restricting his travel and dispatching deputies in his place.
I don't disagree that the job of the Secretary of State is to advise the President, but in this age and time, you can advise the President wherever you are. I traveled a lot. I went 750,000 miles. It was a time of great change in world affairs. I don't think we would have been able to effectuate those changes had I not been willing to get on the airplane and go to other countries.
George Kennan had some quaint notions, like stay at home and advise the president, as if a Secretary of State is able to do that, and I don't think so. I don't think you could tell Colin Powell to behave like George Marshall, except in judgment. And that, in the end, is what George Kennan was really driving at.
In 2004, Kennan was too feeble to attend his own 100th birthday celebration in Princeton. Powell, the keynote speaker, praised Kennan even as he evoked his legacy to justify the invasion of Iraq, an action Kennan had vehemently opposed.
Few people ever find the right balance between the need to adopt a coldly objective attitude toward the world's danger and the equally important need to allow oneself to embrace and to be guided by ideals. George Kennan found that balance, and so must we. We struggle today with a different kind of adversary than those of the 20th century, but one no less contemptuous of liberty and freedom.
Kennan had long since lost control over how others talked about his doctrine of containment. The idea, once let out into the world, had taken on a life of its own.
That just infuriated him when the containment policy was used to promote wars. He used to get really angry with that.
Anybody whose ideas can continue to be alive as guiding doctrine for a foreign policy for that many years, you have to say, they had power. They came at the time where they were needed. They resonated. Of course, they were used and misused beyond their original conception, but the power of them is undeniable.
In some way, we are looking for a new Kennan in American politics. Kennan's approach to foreign policy, he always told me, is that you think how they think, and then you make your analysis and your predictions and your strategies on the basis of it. We don't have that today.
After his speech on that day in Princeton, Powell drove the short distance to see the centenarian at home. Although on most days he could barely get out of bed, Kennan insisted on standing to greet his visitor. It would be, he must have sensed, his final chance to tell a sitting Secretary of State what he was doing wrong.